The reason that we do paper piecing is so that we can get these very, very sharp, narrow points made quite easily. Without paper piecing, you would have to have all these pieces cut individually and then stitch them together individually, and it would be very difficult to get them to line up very accurately. This is a close-up. You can see how sharp those points are. This is from Judy Niemeyer, Quilt Works, and another example of these very, very sharp points that are achieved through paper piecing. And this is also paper piecing down in here. So again, that border is done through paper piecing, and then you can actually see the quilting that was done afterward. This is another example of Judy Niemeyer's work. The quilt is done by paper piecing. All of this in here is the similar type of paper piecing, but these parts, these very curvy parts, this is an applique. So the fabric is cut out after the quilt is done. The fabric, these curls are cut out and then stitched on top of the work, and then you have to have some sort of stitching to close off the edge. So paper piecing, we have, just zoom this out, oops. Paper piecing is done on a foundation paper. So the fabric pieces are actually sewn onto this foundation paper, and from here, these and the templates are actually the pattern of the pieces of fabric that you're going to need to be able to go onto the pattern. And for this page, for example, you can see we have number 1, which is the background, and pieces number 4 and 5, which correspond to spots 1, 4, and 5. To get started, this is our foundation. As I mentioned before, we're going to be actually sewing the pieces of fabric onto the back. So to make it easier to figure out where our pieces of fabric are going to go, and to make sure we have them lined up properly, I'm just going to take a felt marker and I'm going to just make lines. I'm going to trace all of the lines from the front, and the felt marker this fat felt marker is going to be enough that it will show up through to the other side. That way it'll be much easier to make sure that we get everything covered properly. Some of the slightly unusual tools that you're going to need for paper piecing is a glue stick. Now this is a washable glue stick. Elmer's has one, and this Studio brand actually I bought at Dollarama. This is a glue pen, and this one can be very handy because you'll see that the glue is 1/4 of an inch wide, and this could be very helpful to get your seams, your paper pieces put into place properly, so to make it easier for your seaming. Another one is this ruler. It's called Add a Quarter, and what's different about this ruler is that there's actually a ridge. Maybe you can see it if I turn it this way. There, you can see that there's this little ridge. This is very helpful when you have to fold over your seams to get your seam allowances cut properly. And this is just a piece of plastic that is used to fold over the pattern, which you will see how that's being used later. Okay, we're going to get ready to cut the fabric for the paper piecing. This is your foundation, and to remember the purpose of the papers that you're dealing with, think of the foundation as the foundation of a building that you're going to build onto. So that will help to figure out where things are going to be placed. And these are the templates, and you can see that this number 11, for example, is exactly the same size and shape as the 11 space on the foundation. And when you look at it also, you will see that the solid line is going to be your stitching line, and this dashed line is your cutting line. And you can also see that there's a substantial amount of fabric that is allowed around the actual piece that's going to be sewn down, and that'll give you more than enough room to make sure that your section is going to be covered properly. The first step that you're going to do is let's just trim this down along that cutting line, and just cutting that down will make it easier when you lay this onto your fabric. And remember that for our purposes the fabric is laid face down and this is put on top. So with having cut this, you've got a very tidy line already done. That's going to be along the edge of your fabric, so that's one less trimming or cutting that you have to do. And also be careful that your cutting lines are done in a specific order. This is your cut line 1. So once you've got this piece cut off, then you're going to cut this piece, and then you're going to cut this piece. And there's a very specific reason for that, because if you're to go and cut line 2 instead, it's going to be difficult, because you're going to have to make sure that you stop at a certain point so that you don't interfere with this piece. So remember, cut line 1, cut line 2, and cut line 3. And that's something that you will find on it's the same process on commercially produced patterns as well. So once you get used to that, the sewing line is the solid line, this dashed line is your cutting line, and particularly be careful of the order in which you have to make your cuts for your templates on your fabric. The next step in your instructions is to cut out using your templates to cut out your fabric. And you will notice from your template pieces that some are labeled as for the background and some are labeled for the palm. So obviously the fabric for the palm is going to be cut from those templates, and likewise with the background. Be absolutely certain that your fabric, according to your instructions, your fabric is laid on the table face down and the pattern pieces are on top. So this is what it's going to look like, so that to make sure that that's cut correctly. And you'll also notice that on all the pieces it's going to say sew side, because that's the first line that you're going to be sewing. And then I've got my pieces all separated, they're all numbered in order, and I've got all the sew side lined up on top to make it easier to figure out which side I'm going to pick up to be able to sew. The only piece that does not say sew side is the background, and that is because this is going to be the very first piece that is going to go onto the foundation to start actually paper piecing. When you're doing a whole quilt, you can see from, to sort of dissect this, when you can see from this quilt that there's 8 stars, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So this is going to be done in a segment like this diamond. So that will be one foundation paper for that pattern, but you will actually have 8 foundation papers for that particular shape of the diamond. So not only you're going to have 8 foundations for that diamond, but you're going to have the template pieces for each one of these pieces that's going to be going on there. So you're going to be having a whole stack of 8 foundation papers that you're working on at the same time. And for example, here you're going to be starting with this one blue piece. So that piece number 1 is going to be added onto each foundation paper, and then you go ahead and then you put on this piece number 2. And so you're actually taking a stack of 8 foundation papers to the machine each time. And then these will be done separately. So you have another 8 that have to be done, and then when you're actually putting this together, there's going to be pieces. Then now you start building the quadrant, and then there will be pieces to fill in each section of there. So in the meantime, we are going to continue with our single piece. Now we've done number 4, so now we're working on number 5. So I'm back to using my folding ruler between 2, 3, and 5. So I'm still going to do this exactly the same process. Fold that up, and here there was a couple of stitches but beyond the line before, which is okay, so I'm just going to, the paper will actually pull away from that. I'll put on my add a quarter ruler. And yes, there's a lot more fabric to trim here because each piece is giving you adequate, more than adequate fabric to properly cover each segment that has to be done for the pattern. So I'm going to trim that down. I'm going to close my cutter. And from the front, I've got my piece number 5 is ready to go. And we're back to the background again. And I'm going to cover it like that and make sure that I am getting proper coverage. And this time I have moved my piece far enough down that I'm covering the line there, and I can see that the end is way over here and my fabric adequately covers it, so we're good. So you're going to continue on until you've got all the pieces up to number 12, and then we'll take it from, we'll get back together after that. Okay, we're ready to get started to actually start sewing our fabric. So we're going to be dealing with space number 1 first. So I'm going to turn this over, and I'm going to put some glue onto that spot. And this is water-soluble glue, so when you wash the quilt, that will come out. However, please only put the glue onto the paper, not the fabric, because once you get it onto the fabric, it just doesn't seem to want to come off. And because we have these lines to show where that square has to be covered, I like to keep about a ½ an inch beyond the outside edge so that we have plenty of room for trimming and for seams. And our inside seams are going to be trimmed down to a ¼ inch in keeping with the normal ¼ inch seam allowance we have for all of our quilting. So I just want to make sure I get that covered and put that down. Again, wrong side of the fabric to the wrong side of the foundation. So I'm going to turn that over using our folding ruler on the line between 1 and 2 pieces, because that's where we're going to be putting our piece on next. So what we're doing this so that we can get in and trim the excess fabric down to a ¼ inch seam. So I'm going to fold that over top of that, and this is where the add a quarter ruler comes in, and that ridge is very handy, and it just locks right against that edge of the edge of that fabric. And now I have to trim this down to my ¼ inch. So we have a very tidy ¼ inch seam. One word of caution, I'm using a 40, this I believe is a 50 or 45 millimeter rotary cutter. If you're currently using a 25 millimeter rotary cutter, this is too small to go past the edge of the ruler. So if you only have a 25, unfortunately you'll have to switch to a 45 or larger. Now that we have that seam allowance established, I'm going to pick this up. I'm going to drop my folding ruler, and now we are going to put on piece number 2, which is this what happens for the palm. Now we have this piece that is marked as being the sew side. Right sides together. I'm going to place this along the edge of that fabric that we have just cut, so we've got a very tidy seam, and I just want to make sure that this is going to cover that piece that we're dealing with. Now from the right side, we are going to take this to the machine, and we are going to sew this seam. This is where it's very important to have a very small stitch length, because if it's too long, it's going to be very difficult to tear the paper away afterward without pulling out your stitches. So just 1 stitch past there, and because this is the edge, you can sew a little bit past that. But this is the line that we're going to be sewing right now. Okay, I have sewn that seam, and from the back, this is what it looks like. Now we are going to take this piece and we're going to lay it over that to cover that area number 2, and this is going to be pressed. And you want to make sure that you get this pressed. Unfortunately, this is when we have to go to the iron a lot, and you don't want to just do a finger pressing, because you're not going to get as flat the fabric is not going to lay as flat as it has to, as it should, because if it's not flat, you can see that I've got a bubble there. When I go to sew the next piece onto fabric piece number 3, you're going to have this, and you're not going to be able to get rid of it. So it's very important. You can run your finger to do a bit of a finger pressing, but you take it to the iron and you get that pressed very smooth. Okay, we are ready to add our piece number 3. But before we do that, I'm just going to make sure that number 2, that previous piece, is covering my entire area. And if it's not, now is the time to take this off and adjust it and correct it, instead of having to after pieces 7 or 8 suddenly realizing that this is wrong, and then you have to undo a lot more. So before you proceed with your next piece, now is the time to make any corrections. So now we're adding piece 3. So my folding ruler is going on the line between 2 and 3. Make that good crease. Add a quarter ruler with your cutter, trim your seam down, and I'm going to drop the ruler, and now I'm going to add my piece number 3. It might help, it might make it easier to get to the machine if you use your little glue pen, and you can put some dabs of glue along there. Just keep it only in the seam allowance and put that down there. Don't stretch the fabric. Very often these are cut on the bias. You don't want to stretch any of that. Just keep it flat and smooth. Before I go to the machine, I can actually see if my that piece of fabric is going to cover. Here's my number 3, and I can see that it's covered up to there, and I can see it's covering here, so I think I'm good to go. So now I'm going to go to the machine, and I'm going to sew this seam. I usually like to start in the middle and then go out. So that's the seam now that I'm going to sew. Okay, piece number 3 has been stitched down, and I've got a very nice flat seam there. Now, if you're having trouble managing these things, it might make it easier just to put a dab of glue here, just to hold it in place, if that makes things easier for you. And that, so of course now I'm going to flip it over, and now we're proceeding to piece number 4. So again, the ruler on the line between 3 and 4. Fold. Add a quarter. Trim. And now I'm ready for my next piece. There's my sew side, and it's going to go there. So again, I'm now going to check to see, just to peek under to make sure, and actually I'm short. My position here is there, and my fabric is there, so I just have to move this down to make sure that I have this covered. And now my fabric is here, that's covered, and my point is here, so now I'm covered. Now I'm satisfied that when I go and stitch this down, I'm going to have that section number 4 will be properly covered. So I'm going to go sew this down and go to the iron and press it and get ready for number 5. Okay, my block is done, and before I start removing papers, I'm going to use the foundation paper lines to trim this down. So what I'm going to do is line up the 9 1/4 mark with the point between, I guess that's point from number 11, so that's 9 1/4, and I'm using this 45-degree line to line up with the points of the palm sections that are in there. And so we're going to trim those outside pieces first. And when you get to a seam, you may have to go over it a couple of times because it's pretty thick. Okay, and I'm just going to rotate my mat and trim the other side. And now that I've got two sides of it established, I'm going to rotate my ruler, and we're cutting this down to 9.5 inches. So now that we've got two sides established, I can use that to set up myself for the last two cuts. Oops, I shouldn't move it. And now that that is done, we can start removing papers. But before we go any further, now it's going to be very easy to trim off these thread ends, because it's, with it being against the paper, they're easy to pick up and get rid of. If you want to remove them, you don't have to. Now, the tools to remove the paper, very often if you go on other programs, they will refer to a purple fang, which is very often used to remove the papers, but it looks very similar to a citrus peeler. My tools of choice happen to be a pair of tweezers, because that works for me. To remove the papers, I'm just going to, actually if you fold it along one of the seam lines, that will make it easy to tear. When you're tearing the papers, be very careful not to pull on your seams. And this is where you'll see the difference if you used a very small stitch or if your stitching was a little bit too long. And it's not going to tear very easily. And you'll have to be very careful about not damaging your threads. Even there, I'm holding my finger down on the stitching line so that I don't pull on the threads. And once you've got part of it pulled up, you can just carry on and remove all of the other pieces. And again, I'm just, where it's tough or tight, I'm going to hold down my stitching line, because I don't want my threads stretched or worse, pulled out. And where I've got these little pieces here, that's in particular where I'm going to use my tweezers to get those pulled out. So to carry on removing all the pieces, and the palm paper piecing block is finished.